So, at long last, I have the pleasure of introducing Shirin Edwin, who's Associate Professor of French in the Department of Foreign Languages at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas, where she works on Islam and African literatures. She is the author of Mise en relation, le roman francophone de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Came out in 2009. It's a futuristic. She's also the author of Privately Empowered, Expressing Feminism in Islam in Northern Nigerian Fiction, which is forthcoming this fall from Northwestern University Press. And her talk today draws from this project. Just by way of thanks, in addition to thanking Shirin Edwin for being here, I'd like to thank Hauwa and the African Feminist Initiative for making her visit possible. So please join me in giving a warm welcome.
Thank you for being here, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for the introduction, and to Gimba for extending the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here and to have an audience as I talk. As Jonathan was saying, that what I'm going to talk about today is based on my forthcoming book. And so what I decided to do, given the time restriction, is to limit myself to the ideological and the theoretical context of my project on African-Islamic feminism. Most of my work draws very, very heavily from literary analyses. My work is based in literary studies, so I'll reserve that for probably the Q&A after the talk. I'll go very quickly over some of the literary examples, but I wanted to focus on the theoretical side and the ideological focus of what I'm trying to say in the form of African-Islamic feminism. In 2001, Amina Lawal, a 31-year-old Muslim peasant from Katsina state in northern Nigeria, was arrested on charges of adultery and sentenced to death by stoning as laid down in Sharia or Islamic law. She appealed the death sentence for 2 years before being acquitted by an Islamic appeals court in 2003. Lawal's case was not unique. The previous year, Safiya Hussaini, another Muslim woman from Sokoto in northern Nigeria, was convicted on similar charges and condemned to death before being acquitted by an Islamic appeals court. Not unpredictably, these cases, especially the death sentence and the method, death by stoning, attracted the ire of the international community. From international human rights groups, including women's rights organizations, to non-governmental agencies raining fire and brimstone on the purportedly archaic laws observed by 12 of the 36 Nigerian states that have adopted Islamic law. For years following these causes célèbres, European and American media scrutinized them as emblematic of the savagery sanctioned by Islam in northern Nigeria. More recently, Islam in Nigeria took center stage again for the infamous kidnapping of over 200 schoolgirls from their boarding school in Chibok in northern Nigeria, abducted by the terrorist outfit Boko Haram in April 2014. I use these windows and these events as a window to understanding the declensions and the revival in the political and media-driven interest in Islam in Nigeria, which is the most populous country in Africa with an estimated 170 million people, and also is the largest Muslim country in Africa, with Muslims making up roughly half the population. In precisely the undisguised interest in such media-worthy snippets, I identify a thematic pattern where attention to Islam unstintingly pivots on Islamism, fetishizing its diverse forms: political Islam, Islamic activism, militant Islam, legal Islam, among others, in the attempt to proffer a solution for the putative oppression of women sanctioned by the religion. Only infrequently, however, are efforts made to peer into the private lives of Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, even less so into the lives of Muslim women in West Africa who practice Islam in a myriad of secluded, private and apolitical ways with no aspiration to participate in public venues in the forms of memberships to groups or to engage in activism for legal reform or social change. I believe that the rampant oversight of the ordinary lives of African Muslim women stems from the inordinate preoccupation with political, public, and organized approaches to the religion. to mediate the thematic and regional slippage in both African and Islamic feminist discourses vis-à-vis the African Muslim woman, I propose African-Islamic feminism, a theory, a thematic focus, and a critical and discursive practice that three Nigerian novelists who write in English, Zaynab Alkali, Hauwa Ali, and Abubakar Gimba, interpolate in their fiction, illustrating Muslim women's private, personal, and individual engagements with Islamic habits and rituals. In each of their novels that I examine in detail, Alkali's The Stillborn, Virtuous Woman, and The Descendants, Ali's Destiny, and Gimba's The Sacred Apples, in their depictions of African Muslim women, Alkali, Ali, and Gimba frequently explore repertoires of spiritual practice, including certain Islamic rituals such as ṣalāt, dua, dhikr, collectively known as ibadat or forms of prayer, shahādah or Islamic monotheism, hijab or veiling, akhlaq or Islamic virtues that hold no ambition other than securing personal and private satisfaction. African-Islamic feminism, in my reading, thus escorts Islamic feminism out of the Middle East and Arab world, not only regionally, as much of the scholarship constellates on Muslim women in that region, into sub-Saharan Africa, but also out of its political and public goals thematically into women's personal modes of spiritual engagement with Islam. Additionally, within the well-honed rubric of African feminist politics that tends to minimize and even deprecate the impact of Islam on African Muslim women, African-Islamic feminism repatriates the African Muslim woman to African feminist discourse. Considered together, the twin aims of African-Islamic feminism tutor a broader and sharper understanding of Muslim women in general. The relevance of African-Islamic feminism as it thematizes women's private and individual engagements with Islamic spiritual habits in Northern Nigerian fiction in English can furthermore be evidenced in the fact that Alkali, Ali, and Gimba avowedly write in English in a region, parts of Nigeria, Chad, Ghana, and Niger, where Hausa is spoken by no less than 50 million people. The dominant literary genre in northern Nigeria is the thriving and immensely popular Littattafan Soyayya, or books of love, part of the ever-growing socio-literary phenomenon of Kano market literature, sold in the markets and streets of major northern Nigerian cities such as Kano, Zaria, Kaduna, and others. Although not of the Soyayya genre per se, nor in Hausa, the language of Soyayya fiction, Alkali's, Ali's, and Gimba's novels in English serve as windows on Hausa society that is textualized in the more popular but rarely translated Soyayya fiction in Hausa. Indeed, Ali's, Alkali's, and Gimba's novels echo the dominant topoi of Soyayya books: interpersonal relations, romantic love, family, marriage, personal lives, Islam, and private affairs, to announce to a much wider audience of readers than those who read Hausa, namely the English-speaking interlocutors in Nigeria, Africa, and beyond, that African Muslim women are not always politically or even publicly invested in Islam. My purpose is not to simply redress this regional imbalance by adding yet another inquiry to the scant critical iterations on Islam in Africa. My purpose is not to discredit feminist activism either. In fact, of all the Muslim majority countries in West Africa, it is in Nigeria that women's activist efforts are the most prevalent. But to approach feminism in Islam uniquely through an activist lens is to ignore those forms of feminism that do not conduce to the same goals as those of collective, activist, and political efforts. This is all the more relevant today as we face many dangers to global and cultural tolerance, religious extremism, and Islamophobia. A broader understanding of Islam and of Muslim women in particular, as I address in this paper, outside the tenured rubric of activism, foreign policy, politics, and publicly organized expressions of religion, can present themselves as potential solutions to the cultural impasse facing the world today. To this end, I contend that scholarship on Islam and on Islamic feminism in Africa is lopsided insofar as it is conceptually moored to the evolution, articulation, and subsequent dissemination of Islamic feminist discourse itself, the bulk of which remains tenaciously contextualized in the specific histories and events of the Middle Eastern world and the Arab world of Muslim societies, where Islamic feminist movement evolved in tandem with the nation state and derived many of its aims from pronouncements on gender in an Islamic state. In other words, in many Middle Eastern countries such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Mediterranean Middle East, as well as North African countries such as Egypt and Morocco, Islamic feminism evolved from organized and collective, whether or not state-sponsored, efforts to articulate women's rights and functions. The tight embrace between Islam and the methods and aims of feminist movements has rendered the domain of women's activities measurably public, indexed in rallies, demonstrations, and activism, memberships to social groups, organizations, and legal reforms in virtually all spheres of life. Islamic feminism has thus grown in direct proportion to its politically, legally, and collectively activist labor. On the other hand, vast populations, in fact sizable majorities of Muslims, also live in societies that are not Islamic nation states. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, 80 to 90% of the populations in Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, and Niger are Muslim. Interestingly, these countries are not politically organized or governed as Islamic nation states, with their governments instead modeled on European parliamentary systems, legacies of colonial legal structures. As critics put it, Islam is important because it is an area that enjoys immense academic and policy interest. But as I argue, the academic interest in Islam is directly proportionate to the policy interest in it. So Islam is of academic interest because it enjoys policy value. To then study women in such societies as in the Middle East, only where politics or government and religion coalesce in public activism, legal reform, and collective labor, glaringly omits those that are like Niger, the Gambia, and Mali, predominantly Muslim but not Islamically governed, and where Muslim women may express their feminism outside the rubric of public activity or the purview of the government. My analyses of their novels are animated by such core notions as these: the most palpable ways of knowing the materiality of Islam in an African Muslim woman's quotidian existence, the kinds of Islamic activities African Muslim women engage in besides publicly and socially rallying for change, the reasons for which women approach the Quran in addition to it as a reference for legal justice. Consisting of over 200 ethno-linguistic groups, Nigeria's population is diverse and disparate, with roughly half of it being Muslim, concentrated mostly in the northern and southwestern parts of the country. The two main ethnic groups of the Northern Nigerian section are the Hausa and Fulani. The Hausa make up roughly 21% of the Nigerian population. The overwhelming presence of Islam in urban Hausa society percolates into everyday life most prominently through two significantly apolitical phenomena: oral literary productions, of which Hausa storytelling within the household is the most well-known genre, and Kano market literature called Littattafan Soyayya, or books of love, a genre of popular romance fiction in Hausa that dwells on such topics as love, romance, and the adventures of young lovers. My interest in this extremely successful and commercial and literary movement lies, however, in its ingenious capitalization of the personal, private, and individual dimensions of its predominant topoi, the pronounced and continued emphasis by its writers on the personal and private lives of Hausa women that underwrites Soyayya fiction. The unforeseen interest among Hausa youth for indigenous literature in the mid-80s can be located in their avid spectatorship of television melodramas on romantic love, adventurous sagas of young lovers, forced marriages, and family affairs that catalyze the Hausa youth to turn to romantic iconography, adventures, and the intricacies of familial and marital relationships. abetted by cheap production costs, easy availability of computer printing technology, and marketing through small shops and stalls first in the streets of Kano and then in other towns, hence the eponymous epithet Kano market literature, a novel could sell between 10 to 20,000 copies in a matter of weeks and up to 100,000 copies in a few years. Most strikingly, by 2002, the most popular authors of Soyaya fiction were women, and the biggest audience for these novels remains women. Of course, Soyaya writers have been criticized for their insistent preference for light themes in their novels, and consequent to such criticism have even been labeled as inferior. But the biggest criticism of the levity of the Soyaya themes, in fact, counterintuitively underscores their relevance to Hausa society. For the authors persist in centralizing the personal and private domain of women's lives, namely their personal choice in choosing a spouse and pursuing self-improvement in their novels. A biliterate African-Islamic reading of Alkali's, Ali's, and Gimba's fiction reveals that African Muslim women embody key qualities of each of the foundational concepts of African feminist thought: umoja, African womanism, nego-feminism, Stiwanism, and motherism, with an eye to abiding by her Islamic faith. For her African and Islamic identities are not mutually exclusive. Specifically then, the African Muslim woman is an African Muslim womanist, an African Muslim nego-feminist, an African Muslim Stiwanist, an African Muslim motherist, and so on. This biliterate presence and function of African Islamic feminism emerges more powerfully through a closer look at 3 examples on feminism in Islam in northern Nigeria. I examine time or Islamic feminist history in northern Nigeria through the pivotal roles and goals of Nana Asma'u and Queen Amina of Zaria's leadership. I also evaluate space in the practice of seclusion, female seclusion, called kulle in Hausa, and the value of Hausa storytelling, oral storytelling, to use a biliterate reading of Alkali's, Ali's, and Gimba's novels. But first, I briefly examine key concepts that have shaped African feminist theory to unravel a rather unilateral way in which some African feminists approach novels on Islam in Africa to emphasize the urgency for a biliterate reading of African feminist novels and recuperate African Islamic feminist discourse. African feminists look with favor on key terms such as African womanism, umoja, nego-feminism, Stiwanism, and motherism, among others, to explain African feminism. Even as African theorists extrapolate African American feminist ideas to the environment of the African woman, as does Chikwenye Ogunyemi's extension of the African American feminist Bell Hooks concept of womanism, a form of feminism for the black woman who is doubly marginalized by her own society's sexist attitudes and the white world outside it, Ogunyemi feels that feminism and African American womanism overlook African peculiarities. She therefore asserts a need to define African womanism that aims to establish healthy relationships among people. Ogunyemi takes African womanism's central ideas to read a number of African feminist novels, including Alkali's The Stillborn and The Virtuous Woman. Surprisingly though, Ogunyemi reads African Muslim women in African Islamic feminist literature as observing the iniquities of the religion, as Islam makes sexist demands on the women. Ogunyemi finds it oppressive that the Muslim female protagonists remain hidden, invisible, and unheard behind a veil. Ogunyemi's reading of African Islamic feminist texts markedly departs from the African womanist script that she recommends for African feminist texts in general. In my reading of Alkali's The Stillborn, I find that the female protagonists, Lee and Hauwa, the 2 main protagonists in the novel, are not veiled, hidden, or invisible. In Alkali's The Virtuous Woman, the main protagonist, Nana I, wears the veil, but it doesn't stop her from undertaking a journey of about 1,000 kilometers to go back to school at the start of a new term. She is anything but invisible if, by invisibility, one means lack of access to basic amenities such as education. The African Muslim, therefore, is an African Muslim womanist. is what I argue. Another well-known African feminist, Mary Kolawole, reprises Ogunyemi's identification of the sources of multiple subjugation of African women by patriarchy, tradition, colonialism, neo-colonialism, racism, and gender imperialism, that thwart her efforts of self-assertion and forwards the term umoja, the Swahili word for togetherness, unity, or coalition, as a way for dialogic action that enhances the accommodation of diverse attitudes to the woman's question without undermining one's African identity. I find that the chief features of African feminism as umoja or togetherness are consistently present in Alkali's The Stillborn and the Virtuous Woman and in Gimba's The Sacred Apples. Each of the protagonists that I examine in these novels, Lee in Alkali's The Stillborn, Nana I in The Virtuous Woman, and Zahra in Gimba's The Sacred Apples, works in coalition with men in constructing her feminism, which is the chief feature of umoja in the first place. Nana's grandfather in The Virtuous Woman, Baba Sani, encourages her education. Zahra's second husband, Nusa, in Gimba's The Sacred Apple, and her half-brother, Ya Sharif, support her professional endeavors as Lee rebuilds her marriage by returning to her estranged husband, Habu Adams, soon after professing faith in Islamic monotheism. Furthermore, these protagonists craft their feminisms in Islam within the core canons of umoja, namely marriage, motherhood, and family. What obtains from an African-Islamic reading of African feminist literature is that even in such patriarchal societies as those found in northern Nigeria, where Islam is said to have snatched women's historically strong and social rights, of all the possible resources, Muslim women instrumentalize none other than their Islamic practice, spiritual habits, and rituals to organize their personal and private lives. Nonetheless, the inclusionary foundational concepts of African feminist thought are momentarily set aside when platonically evoking the presence of Islam to celebrate Africa's bewildering diversity. In this regard, the Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka's bold critique of Islam in Africa must be very briefly mentioned here, for it has single-handedly added the greatest discursive weight to critical iterations on the virtual illegality of Islam's presence in Africa. Soyinka's persistent assessment of the religion that enslaved an entire continent, positioning Islam as a contestant in a soul-grubbing match, the contest for the African soul, as he puts it, by two religious superpowers, Islam and Christianity, unravels the predicament at the core of the polemics on Islam in Africa in his declaration that the crossover line considered between a free man and a slave was often contiguous with a readiness for conversion. The relevance of a sustained personal, private, and individual engagement with Islam, I believe, can be best understood by reframing both the means for which African Muslim women interact with Islam. Since my study draws on attention to personal, private, and the individual modes of interaction with Islam, in contrast to the political and public ways, the means of interaction are discernibly established. To complete the other half of this equation, the goals must also be reframed, redefined. For reframing the goals returns renewed focus on the relevance of the means of spiritual engagement, or quite simply the personal, private, and individual ways of interacting with Islam. I therefore repatriate Amina of Zaria's or Nana Asmau's names to the list of African female leaders, not to prove that African Muslim women were and are indeed great leaders, but the goals of their exemplary work geared toward the personal and private in Islam. Moving on to physical seclusion or kulle in Hausa, I focus on women's ability to mobilize precisely the personal, private, and individual ways to control the local economy without economic control or autonomy being the aspired end of economic engagement. And on the same lines, I show how personal, private, and individual talent, geared primarily toward fulfilling maternal duties, serves as the fulcrum of education for an entire society in Hausa oral storytelling to foreground and broaden the discussion on Muslim women's feminisms. The Hauwa, who have been historically Muslim, boast of a long line of women leaders. As David Jones observes on Hauwa female leadership, that the Hauwa Empire, composed of 7 states, came into existence in AD 1050, the end product of continuous rule by a line of 17 queens. Chief among the 17 queens was Queen Amina of Zaria or Zazao, who ruled Kano in the early 15th century. Her reign lasted for about 37 years. Amina's example is thus a useful rejoinder to the oversight of African-Islamic leadership by regions that arrogate to themselves pioneering leadership in Islamic feminism. Leila Ahmed, for instance, titles one of her chapters "The First Feminists" in her benchmark study Women and Gender in Islam, that is considered a canonical work in Islamic feminism. In providing the names of the first feminists, Huda Sharawi, Mai Ziada, Doria Shafiq, and Zaynab Al-Ghazali, as eminent examples of the divergent voices in feminism in Egypt, Islamic feminism bears the imprint of a society where Islamic feminism resonates with women's activism, political participation, and presence in the public sphere. Moreover, Amina is not the only first feminist for African Muslim women. Nana Asmau's extraordinary intellectual, organizational, and religious contributions also left an indelible imprint on Islamic feminist history in West Africa. African-Islamic theorist Aisha Imam historicizes the tone for Islamic feminism in West Africa by acknowledging Asmau's iconic role, and that the earliest Islamic societies in northern Nigeria laid the foundation for Muslim women's positions in West Africa that persist even to this day. For the African Muslim women, her leaders lie in Nana and Amina. While the Prophet Muhammad's wife Aisha may have stepped onto the battlefield as Leila Ahmed recounts her military exploits, the Prophet's favorite wife was also an unmatched spiritual exemplar. The role or the core of Asmau's goals abidingly center on piety and spiritual wisdom, even in the Yantaru movement that she revived for Muslim women and children in the Sokoto Caliphate. In existence since the 16th century, a movement of moral reform, the Yantaru taught Muslim women the values of Islam to be imparted to their families as wives, teachers, and mothers to produce God-fearing citizens. But it was believed to be systematized by Asmau in the 19th century with the aim of making its citizens, particularly women, adopt behaviors that resonated with the mission of the Sokoto Caliphate. And yet it is not the Yantaru, the movement, however, but Asmau, the individual, whose impact is felt even to this day. Notwithstanding the common historical precedents of socio-religious activism and piety in the Yantaru in northern Nigeria, and the Islamic revival that the contemporary mosque movement in Egypt derives from, the mosque movement continues its socio-religious activism to galvanize piety in the personal domains of women's lives. And Asmau's message, more than the movement itself, has been incorporated in the private sphere within the personal domain in the lives of women in northern Nigeria. The emphasis on Islamically correct personal living and faithfully deploying Islamic behavior in one's private affairs also assumes salience in Hausa women's long tradition of oral storytelling and their economic involvement through extra-market retail. Oral storytelling in Hausa among women has evolved into women using their growing literacy to write their own poems and publicly perform them for economic gain. My interest, therefore, into the personal, private, and individual nature of such activities pulls back from the public arena into which Hausa women have of late extended their creative energies, and fixes on the private ways that women continue to pursue these engagements. In this private universe of the household, then, for equally private goals such as motherhood, the Muslim woman relies on her personal and individual resources of oral skills, creative talents, her education in traditional stories, and her judgment to transmit a trove of tales for her audience. She must patiently and resourcefully choose the stories, organize her narration, rehearse the tone, tenor, and tempo of her delivery, and perform the stories with confidence and skill to fulfill her maternal duties of entertainer and educator to her children and family. The African Muslim woman thus conjures a broad register of skills and talents, intellect, eloquence, creativity, and imagination in narrative techniques, pedagogy, and self-confidence without external tutoring, styling, or guidance. Her stewardship of this art form, given its significance in the Hausa community, therefore, is vital to the continuity of the Hausa language and its orature that for most critics remains hidden as it reveals no manifest value as externally visible, viewable, or public activities do. And on the same lines of validating women's personal and private engagements with Islam, I examine the robust presence of extra market retail among Northern Nigerian Muslim women through the phenomenon that is also prevalent among Muslim women in southern Nigeria and among Hausa women in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa such as Ghana and Niger. In her pioneering fieldwork on the hidden trade in Hausa land, in a small village on the Nigerian border with Niger, about 20 kilometers from Katsina, in Batagarawa, Polly Hill discovered the peculiar absence of a traditional marketplace in the village and found instead a highly developed form of extra market retail, a parallel economy operated by fully secluded Muslim women from the confines of their household compounds, successfully running a marketplace of incomparably greater importance than the ones established after several attempts in the village. In place of the traditional marketplace in Batagarawa, however, Hill found small vendors, mostly outside of homes in doorways or in the privacy of their husbands' compounds, where secluded women retailed in foodstuffs, vegetables, and small quantities of food grains. My interest in such a phenomenon lies not in the sophistication of this parallel economy. I am more interested in closely examining the site, the household, that has allowed women to upstage the existence or presupposition of a traditional market, the heart of economic activity in West African villages and towns. The household is a personal, private, and individual place of dwelling that women use as their base to operate production, marketing, and retail of their products, where economic activity or autonomy is not the main objective of women's commercial activities. African-Islamic feminism thus transforms and sharpens our growing understanding of feminism as Alkali's, Ali's, and Gimba's fiction generates new meanings for feminism in Islam and reformulates our assumptions about the means and ends of Islamic feminism. To globally impact feminism, both African and Islamic feminists must imperatively enact thematic and regional biliteracy and inclusively harness the common foci of their preoccupations. I conclude by wondering how we can meet the global challenges on religious intolerance and extremism headlong if we don't incur in ourselves the curiosity about what Muslims do on a daily basis. I leave you by asking how many of us know when the next time for the daily prayer in Islam comes in today. I add by asking how many of us know when the holy month of Ramadan starts this year. These realities are not alternative, but constitutive of what Muslims do on a daily basis. And if we are not able to demonstrate sensibility to these realities, we may fall short in our understanding of Muslims, no matter how sophisticated our policies and discourses on them may be. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for your talk. We have some time for questions and discussion. I'd like to lead things off with just first saying I really like this combination of a methodology of intimacy, the importance of thinking intimately about the intricacies of daily life, with the formation of an ideological counterpublic of the private. And I'd love to hear more on that front about some of the markets that you described that mediate that possibility. And I'm really interested in hearing how those domestic marketplaces work in terms of the circulation of the kinds of books that you're describing. How do they get, how does publishing integrate itself with these sort of domestic markets? Could you say more about that, how that works? I think it really gives a really impressive picture of again, the idea that, that an ideological formation can actually happen.
You were talking about Kano market literature?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's the most, what I found from my own readings and my visit to parts of northern Nigeria was there is on every street corner, every street stall, these stores abound in Litakfan Soyaya. This is the books of love. And I just realized that first of all, it's very cheap to produce and reproduce these books. And given the government's literacy program in the early 80s, women took to making themselves literate, Hausa women, so that they could become authors and write this fiction. And they have come under a severe criticism at academic conferences and saying that their topics really they should be more relevant. They should talk more about unemployment, AIDS, and corruption, and social problems. And they've always contended, these women have always contended that these are relevant topics. Even if this is about our personal lives, it's about our personal domain, it's about marriage, and it's about childhood, or it's about our duties as mothers or as wives. This is relevant. So, was that what you were asking?
Well, if I may just follow up quickly, I'd just love to hear about the publishing too. I mean, are they being circulated by mail?
They're locally published, yes. Actually, okay, I get it. They first started out as drama clubs, and it was much more expensive to mount a drama, stage a play, than to print or publish a book. And so they found it was very cheap with computer printing technology just to produce and copy those books. So the publishing is basically local, and they do get some help, but it's very cheap. Somehow they are able to do it on. Actually, production costs outside of America for books is very cheap the world over, and Nigeria is no exception. I mean, books I think outside of America cost a lot less than they do in America. So it's much cheaper and easier to produce books.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about this distinctiveness of the Muslim traditions that you're talking about, because there's a huge Onitsha market literature, which is exactly the same form, right? Yes. So that's one thing I have a question about is just trying to trace what the Islamic components of this are, because there's also more generally a dismissiveness of sub-Saharan African women's domestic life and a lack of interest in it, a lack of understanding of the importance of the domestic. And so this would come not only in relation to, how is this use of women's capitalization on the market literature distinctively Islamic, but it also raises the other question of how are the storytelling practices as piece of the family education distinctively Islamic, because that also exceeds in sub-Saharan Africa the Islamic kind of piece. So I completely understand that you're not trying to draw some kind of artificial apartheid, so I'm not trying to push it that way. I'm just really interested in what makes this distinctly Islamic.
Oh, okay.
I mean, apart from...
right. It's mostly the themes, the topics. I see. What makes it Islamic? Okay.
Yeah, because the themes of the Onitsha market literature are love, romance, it's all the same stuff, and also the raising of children in non-Islamic rural households is also around the oral literacy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But it also exists in northern Nigeria. So I was focusing my research on that part of Africa. It's just that northern Nigeria is predominantly Islamic. People will say that it's 100% Islamic, and even the small minorities that are not Islamic, so if there's a minority Christian population, they tend to assume that every law that's passed there, and which is Islamic law, is also meant for them, for the non-Muslim population. It's that prevalent to that extent. So when you talk about literary themes, they surface in these novels in the forms of, for instance, rituals. The daily, the quotidian existence of this woman would be probably rhythmed by the prayer times, and so what I was reading was why is the author going through great pains to describe and punctuate this woman's lifestyle in this narrative with the prayer times, or the prayer that she says, and that's what made me curious.
Yeah.
So, and Onisha actually is also in English, as opposed to Litathan Soya, which is in Hausa.
Hausa,
And
yes.
so these need translation, and I've only been able to, because I speak very little Hausa, I've not been able to read them in the original Hausa text. I've only read translations. What I found is from literature coming out of Northern Nigeria in English reflected the same themes, and that is what got me interested in this. Like these novels like Alkali, Ali and Gimba, which people virtually have not heard of outside of West Africa.
It's also not the traditional Western feminist negotiation of private-public space.
Right. We tend to assume, right, that whatever is viewable, and feminism is also always about fighting for something.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks so much. It's really good.
Hi, Shirin. Thank you so much for this. You've given me so much to think about. I sort of redeveloped the African-Islamic feminist discourse. And I was thinking more specifically about the relationship between African-Islamic feminism and political participation. You mentioned political participation. And I'm thinking here particularly in the case of Morocco. And I think about, because you made a distinction between Islamic societies that are sort of Islamically governed and those who are not, right? And so, this is just to share with you. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but I'm thinking about non-literate women, right, who don't have access to reading and writing literature. And I think in a place like Morocco, where you have a very strong notion of what Islam is, right? So you have the official version of Islam, and then you have sort of women, and specifically non-literate women, right, who sort of don't fit within this official discourse, right, of Islam, and have their practices and sort of their private lives that makes it completely contradictory with what official Islam is. Now, these women's sort of narratives, I guess I'm looking at sort of the voices of these women that become completely sort of silenced within an official discourse, and how do we access the voices of these women, right, who are also non-literate, don't have sort of a literary form, that they, write stories. And so, I guess, how do we engage with their political participation?
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what I'm just sort of thinking about.
I'm asking the same questions actually, because there is this non-official discourse and non-official practice and non-official presence, and I was trying to explore and dig up the same thing through these texts. So I guess I'm asking the same question. The only thing was, when you said towards the end, political participation, I don't know, well, that actually gets more easily indexed in discursive practice, I suppose. If it is of policy or political interest, it would probably get transferred and transported more quickly. There is more mobility there. But apolitical participation, or even women who don't aspire to political participation or activity, I don't know. I myself would probably continue asking the same question.
Okay, all right, thank you.
In line with that question, I was wondering, how do these women position themselves within the feminist movement? So, reading them as works of African and Islamic feminism, but do they consider themselves feminists, or how do they relate to other feminists in Nigeria or in Africa in general?
Oh, great question. You mean women, the authors or the protagonists? The authors, I don't think they position themselves at all. See, I feel that the feminist movement is really a discursive construction, and what circulates mostly in European and American academia. So I think that and because of that, we tend to look for some kind of relevance and with some kind of intelligibility to trying to understand the feminist movement. I don't believe that any of these authors, Gimba is actually the only male author. The other two are women, Alkali and Ali. Abubakar Gimba is a man actually, and he writes about women. But the other two, I don't think their first novel, they wrote in the 80s, right up till recently, in 2005 is when Alkali's most recent novel was published. I didn't really see any kind of feminist aspiration as such. I just saw that she was writing about things where in a society which is predominantly Islamic because of the Islamic law, and she was saying things that probably we used to, most of us used to American and European discourses, feminist discourses, would find regressive.
So they don't even use the term feminism or something?
No, they do. In interviews I've read, I've come across the word. In the novels itself, I didn't really see them positioning themselves on a feminist discursive continuum. But I guess, again, I would say that, just so that I can answer your question, I would say that they whatever they think of as feminist it would be regressive, according to most people.
Thank you so much. I echo hers. Thanks to you. There's much to think about. I'm interested in two aspects of your talk. First of all, a charge to us as critics to become biliterate, which I found a very intriguing notion, and especially for those of us who look both at literature and representations of religious expression, and somebody like Sabah Mahmoud in her work on the piety, the activist piety of Muslim women in the mosque movements in Egypt looked like a very different form of agency. And she called on us, so to speak, to provincialize our notions of agency, and especially, ideas of women's subjectivity that are so predicated on the northern and on the Western model. So it seems to me that you're asking for us to expand that project, and I'm very interested in your concept of biliterate capacity or resource, which I think is a very interesting challenge to us as critics. The other thing that I'm intrigued about is perhaps also something that Maha was reaching toward, which is in these representations written by women about some men, and that address the ordinary practices of women's lives. You had mentioned that Muslim women practice Islam in a variety of ways, and is that variety, which might come to seem syncretic and dissident and heterodox, is that also evident in the texts that you have seen?
Absolutely, yes. I did notice, just to answer the second part of your question, yes, in The Descendants, that is Alkali's most recent novel, she presents women on a wide range of, a whole spectrum of Islamic practices, from the matriarch of the family who prays and is very observant of Islamic rituals and habits, to her granddaughter who doesn't at all and cares very little for that the ritual observance. So a whole range, and you can place them on this kind of a spectrum, and it's precisely to show that complexity, this kind of a knotted overlay of different reactions and interactions with Islam. Some of them stop praying midway. Some of them pray and then suddenly they lose faith. That happens all the time. And I felt that was why it was such a brave effort on the part of these Northern Nigerian writers to present that kind of complex weave of different reactions women may have to the religion. And to broaden that understanding that we have of feminist discourse in Islam. Yes, and the first part you were saying about Sabah Mahmoud, I completely agree. I draw a lot on her work in this project as well. I do also take issue on some parts with her about this whole idea of agency, and this, after all, the mosque movement is precisely that, it's a movement. But what about women who fall below that radar of movement and agency?
Yeah, I think you're much more interesting than her, actually.
You're very kind.
How would you train people in biliteracy? If I were to take seriously and try to advance my own pedagogy to say, well, I want to produce scholars and students who are biliterate, what do you suggest? What does that mean?
Well, I think I should qualify the way I use the term. The way I use biliteracy is to draw on multiple sources, that's all, and not to foreclose anything as such. That's all I was trying to say. I wasn't trying to go into the term as such. But I found it useful because you can look at, I wasn't trying to discredit whatever the feminist discourse that exists till now. In fact, I'm indebted to that work. Most of what I've done, in fact, is an inspiration from that. But I feel that we could push a little further and to broaden our focus to include those forms of feminism that do not get neatly located on these feminist discourses, and the discursive practice also behind it, because we tend to look at feminism in predictable places.
Thanks for your talk. If I were a social scientist, then I would ask this. What is your baseline? And what I mean by that is it wasn't quite clear to me from your talk in that you have selectively talked about a limited set of authors in what I assume is a fairly expansive genre, but again, I may be understanding this out of Western romance that it sort of reminds me of, right? Literature written largely by women for women about these kinds of topics. In other words, to put it another way, if there are several authors, many authors that you haven't talked about.
Yeah, actually, yes. What I was trying to do here was, I was looking at these three authors in English, which is a language I'm familiar with, and which is a language that I feel that I have an audience for, which is precisely the reason why these three writers also write in English, because they know that they'll have a wider audience.
And how many writers in all write in English in this genre?
Oh, there are plenty. I mean,
there are many. Okay.
Nigerian writers,
Yeah.
many of them, because Nigeria was a former British colony, so the English is the official language, and you'll find many. You just have to go looking for them. What I was trying to do was connect the topoi of these three writers that I examine with the environment where their work draws breath, and that's the Soyaya environment, and that's the connection I was trying to make.
And how did you choose these particular authors?
More out of familiarity. I've just stayed with them for so long and examined them, but there are many others out there as well. Nigerian writers. Is that what you're asking? Nigerian writers who write?
Yeah, it's just a question of exemplarity, that I'm trying to
Oh, I took a
try to
small
grasp,
sample.
right? In other words, if someone were to go and choose a different sample set of authors, could they come to different kinds of insights than you have?
Absolutely.
Okay.
My intention wasn't to foreclose those possibilities either. They could come to different conclusions. Yes. Are you a social scientist?
No.
I'm a digital humanist. A failed social scientist.
Yes.
I'll ask this question because I think it picks up on a thread, and I'm curious to hear you answer it directly. I think Maha's question about when things sort of become visible or sort of indexable as sort of political activity as such. I'm curious about that line of questioning, and then this line of questioning about the passage from these sort of generic topoi from Hausa into English, and whether that passage into English is that point of making visible, of indexicality, of making indexable, I suppose. Because that thesis doesn't satisfy me very much. And I think that you're asking something a little bit more sophisticated than sort of just the politics of language and circulation, but yet they don't seem completely extricable from each other. The sort of passage of these kinds of plots, these kinds of stories consciously, right, into English, and therefore as something that will circulate more widely, have a potentially larger audience, etc., right, on the part of the author choosing to write in English, is a sort of, that isn't merely about market, but also political action, about making certain forms of realms of experience visible?
Could be, yes, absolutely. Yes, you're saying that this could also be an act of political expression?
Yeah.
Yes, the women, in fact, this has been interpreted also the fact that women have been taken, women are not only the largest audience, but they are the biggest authors, the largest, the widest authors, yes. That's also an act of political expression and engagement. That itself. I was trying to, again, I'm trying to limit myself only to looking at the themes. What do we typically look at in feminist discourse? What we've seen is, so far we've relied on feminist histories and feminist discourses that were contextualized mostly elsewhere, that may not be relevant to Muslim women in other parts of the world. Most of these histories were contextualized in a small population that has been of immense political and policy interest to America and Europe. So now if we're going to assume, and that's why I mentioned Leila Ahmed, because not because I want to disagree with her, but when she says the first feminists are these women who were Egyptian mostly, they may not resonate with Western African Muslim women who might have different leaders. So that was the connection I was trying to say, that the Middle East is a very small population. So I was trying to place my work in West Africa, which is also predominantly, especially Nigeria, which is roughly half Muslim, to show that these women may have different leaders. These women might find feminism in different places. Like if we can find feminism, for instance, in political leadership that does not redound to women's public activity, then we can find a feminism even in other topics, is what I was trying to say. Just like rituals. Who would think that that would be an expression of feminist activity? So that's what I was trying to connect here. And when you look at the themes also, we're always looking at women's electoral rights. We're looking at organizations, agency movements, for more public and political participation of women in spheres that we can view them. But you could find feminism even in places that do not conduce to these roles, and those are the arguments I was trying to make.
Great. Thank you so much. Please join me. Thank you.